Good afternoon and welcome. I am Megan Schuller, the legal director of the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a white woman with long blondish hair who I believe qualifies as middle-aged, and I'm wearing a blue shirt. A few housekeeping items. We have captions available by clicking the captions button on the toolbar below, or by clicking the stream text link available in the chat. We also have ASL interpreters available who will be spotlit during today's event and who hopefully you're seeing right now. If you need assistance, please email us at communications@bazelon.org. I am delighted to welcome you to the Bazelon Center's Olmstead at 25 event today. We have over 200 people here from across the country, including many partners with whom we've worked for decades. Representatives from federal, state, and local governments, people with lived expertise, and a groundswell of new advocates and partners with whom we look forward to working. We also have quite a few law students and college interns here today. Welcome. We hope you learn, join the movement, and share the hard realities and practical solutions that you will hear from our speakers and panelists today. For over 50 years, the Bazelon Center has advocated for the civil rights, full inclusion, and equality of adults and children with mental disabilities. The center was pivotal in expanding the civil rights movement to include fighting discrimination against and segregation of people with mental disabilities, and played a key role in the historic case of Olmstead VLC, Lois Curtis, that brings us together today. We work every day to realize its promise that people with disabilities be treated as equal members of our society. As we know too well, people with mental health conditions, especially those with serious conditions, face discrimination, poverty, too few treatment resources, and over-policing and over-incarceration. They are too often silenced, ignored, and erased, but not today. Today, you'll hear from people who identify as peers and individuals with lived experience. After being hospitalized and caught up in a mental health system that set them up to fail, they have risen and become leaders and advocates. Their stories and their voices need to be heard. Their stories offer the solutions so that youth can get help before they're ever hospitalized and can remain with their families and in their communities. Today, you'll hear about the Supreme Court's seminal decision in Olmstead v. Lois Curtis and Elaine Wilson in 1999. This Supreme Court decision radically changed disability rights. Now, people often refer to this case as Olmstead, but to clarify, Mr. Olmstead, the former commissioner of the Georgia Department of Human Resources, was the named defendant in the case, and he lost. The heroes of the story were Lois Curtis and Elaine Wilson, two women from Georgia with mental health and intellectual disabilities who were approved to get services in the community, wanted to live in the community, but remained in an institution due to the lack of community-based services. It is because of their will, their persistence, and their experiences that the Supreme Court held that unnecessary institutionalization and segregation of people with disabilities is discrimination, prohibited by the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehabilitation Act. Because of these two heroes, the highest court in our nation recognized that disabled people are as capable and as worthy of participating in community life as everyone else. Yet, 25 years later, based on the same unwarranted assumptions that Lois Curtis and Elaine Wilson faced, people with disabilities of all ages are still being shuttered away and stripped of their rights and autonomy. We're here today to talk about how this Supreme Court decision has been applied to the many systems serving children and youth, including state Medicaid programs, the child welfare system, schools, and carceral settings. To be clear, it's almost always more appropriate and more effective for children with disabilities, including serious mental health conditions, to be cared for at home than in an institution. Research shows that parents want to care for their children at home, but are often denied the services and support needed to do so. As a result, youth with mental health disabilities are increasingly at risk of harmful encounters with law enforcement and being sent away to treatment facilities. If we want to uphold and honor the legacy of Lois Curtis and Elaine Wilson, we need to be talking about how we support children and families, and about the millions of people with mental disabilities, especially Black and Brown youth with mental disabilities, too many of whom are still not getting the school and community-based services they need and to which they have a legal right. This means expanding Medicaid, investing in our healthcare workforce, and meeting children where they are with what they need. Now, how do we do that? Well, no one is better positioned or more qualified to answer that question than our keynote speaker today, a lifelong advocate for community living and longtime champion of this work, Alison Barkoff. She has been at the forefront of national efforts to expand the home and community-based services that make community living possible. Now, I may be biased since she is a former Bazelon Center attorney, and I had the pleasure of working with her over a decade ago when she was special counsel for Olmstead enforcement in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. But her advocacy and accomplishments for people with disabilities in the federal government, at the Center for Public Representation, and at the Bazelon Center over several decades speak for themselves. It is my honor to welcome Alison Barkoff, Principal Deputy Administrator and Acting Administrator and Assistant Secretary for Aging at the Administration for Community Living in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Alison, we know you're very busy. Thank you for being with us today to mark the 25th anniversary of Olmstead.
Thank you so much, Megan, for that introduction and for the honor of joining you at this event celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Supreme Court's decision in Olmstead versus LC. Let me start with a brief visual description. I'm a middle-aged white woman with curly brown hair, wearing a black suit with a flowered blouse. And I'm in my office with flags behind me and some posters on the wall, and my pronouns are she, her. 25 years ago, the Supreme Court made clear that people with disabilities have a civil right to live and fully participate in their communities. The decision poignantly talks about the harms segregating disabled people from society cause. Segregation devalues and stigmatizes people with disabilities, perpetuating unwarranted assumptions that people with disabilities cannot or are not worthy of being part of their communities. Separating disabled people from broader society deprives them of the many things everyone takes for granted in their lives. Things like being part of their family, having friends, working, going to school, and participating in community activities. And although the Supreme Court's words were written a quarter century ago, they still ring true. I've spent my life, both personally and professionally, fighting to make the promise of Olmstead real. All of us have seen firsthand the changes in the lives of people when they are given the opportunity and the supports they need to live the lives they want in the community. And I've seen how much richer our communities are when everyone is part of them. For anyone who is lucky enough to know Lois Curtis, you know that she and Elaine not only transformed the law and impacted millions of people across the country, but that Lois became an incredible artist and a valued member of her community in my home state of Georgia. But 25 years after the Supreme Court's ruling, there are still far too many people who could and want to live in the community, but can't because of a lack of access to the community services they need to do so. The Olmstead decision was not the immediate sea change that so many of us had hoped. The work of systems change is long and hard, taking a combination of legal and policy advocacy. But over time, we have made important progress because of the partnership between the disability community and the federal government. After the Olmstead decision, disability advocates like the Bazelon Center and the Protection and Advocacy Network that's funded by ACL began developing legal theories to expand the reach of the Olmstead decision, going from a focus on state-funded institutions to a wide range of privately funded institutions, and then to segregated day and educational settings. These legal scholars and incredible litigators applied these cases to a whole range of adults and children with disabilities. And as a baby lawyer at the Bazelon Center, I was so fortunate to be part of shaping the early Olmstead landscape. When the Obama Department of Justice identified Olmstead as an enforcement priority, they came to where the experience was. They recruited Olmstead litigators from the disability advocacy community. And I was so privileged to join DOJ as their special counsel on Olmstead enforcement, along with former Bazelon board member and current HHS general counsel, Sam Bagenstos. The strategic partnerships in Olmstead enforcement that began at that time, partnering between Olmstead litigators in the disability community and the federal government, and that have continued, have been so impactful. Disability advocates know best the issues on the ground and are key partners in helping shape cases and implementing change. And when that's combined with the power of the federal government's enforcement authority, the results are truly unparalleled. But that public-private partnership has not been limited just to legal advocacy. Again, all of you who are participating today have been part of a partnership working with federal agencies to expand access to the community services that help people live, work, and participate in the community. Things like home and community-based services, ACT teams, crisis services, and supported housing. The federal agency that I lead, the Administration for Community Living, is in many ways an outgrowth of the Olmstead decision. Our mission is exactly that of the Olmstead decision, to ensure that all people, regardless of type of disability, age, level of support need, have the opportunity to live and fully participate in all aspects of life. And we work to make the promise of Olmstead a reality through the work of our disability and aging networks, our partnerships with other federal agencies and states, and our role as the advisor to the HHS Secretary on disability and aging policy. And it has truly been the privilege of a lifetime to work for a president and a secretary who has been so committed to ensuring that people with disabilities of all ages can access the supports they need to be valued community members. I joined the Biden administration on day one at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Disabled people and institutions were at highest risk of COVID infections and death, making up the vast majority of deaths early in the pandemic. People with disabilities were being denied life-saving treatment, told their lives were less valuable than those of non-disabled people. And people with disabilities in the community were losing access to critical services, becoming isolated and often at risk of institutionalization. And that's why we quickly decided that an absolute must-do for HHS was to update our regulations implementing Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act to make clear that these types of actions are illegal. ACL was so pleased to partner with HHS's Office for Civil Rights, working together with HHS's General Counsel, Sam Bagenstos, again, in this important effort. I am so proud that last month, HHS released the first comprehensive update to the 504 regulations in almost 50 years. These new regulations cover a wide range of issues, from discrimination in medical treatment to accessibility of medical equipment, websites, apps, and kiosks, to discrimination in child welfare systems. Relevant to today's celebration, the HHS regulations incorporate the 25 years of case law and sub-regulatory guidance interpreting Olmstead. The regulations make clear that Olmstead applies to all types of segregation, residential, day, educational, to people with all types of disabilities of all ages, and to people both experiencing and at serious risk of segregation. The regulations make clear that federal funding, particularly Medicaid, can help states meet their Olmstead obligations. And our partners at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services are working closely with states to help them take advantage of the many Medicaid options for expanding community services. The next panel is focused on Olmstead and children with disabilities. And as I know that you'll hear from them, too many children with disabilities end up in segregated settings as a result of involvement with the child welfare system. The new 504 regulations prohibit discrimination by child welfare systems and specifically require them to provide services to children with disabilities in the most integrated setting appropriate to their needs, which almost always is their own home or family home when they can't live with their own family. Bazelon has been at the forefront of this intersection of Olmstead and child welfare in cases like KDA and JK, cases I was able to work on during my time, and I'm so excited to see from my current perch how Bazelon and others leverage these new HHS regulations. At HHS, we've complemented our work on the Section 504 regulations with efforts to expand access to community services. The administration has invested more than $37 billion in expanding a wide range of community services, including behavioral health services, as a result of the American Rescue Plan. And this has complemented billions of dollars of new investments in behavioral health supports, including funding for 988 and a range of community-based crisis services. ACL was pleased to work with CMS on the development of the Medicaid Access Rule, also released this spring. It is the most consequential regulation expanding access to community services in more than a decade, with provisions to strengthen the direct care workforce, ensure timely access to service, and improve the quality of services, among other things. We also know that affordable, accessible housing is a critical component of community living, and that's why we've launched and are leading a partnership across HHS and HUD called the Housing and Services Resource Center to build partnerships between Medicaid, housing, disability, aging, and behavioral health agencies and stakeholders to coordinate services and housing that people with disabilities need to remain in the community. We're also focused on strengthening the direct care workforce through our new Direct Care Workforce Strategies Center. These are just a few of the highlights of the many ways that the Biden administration and HHS are working to make the promise of Olmstead a reality. As I look ahead, I am optimistic. We know what it takes to support people to live well in the community, and we are making progress in making those services more available. We now have additional powerful regulations that can help shape service systems, and we have strong partnerships between federal agencies and disability advocates. So, thank you to the Bazelon Center and to everyone listening in for all you have done and continue to do. Together, we will not rest until the full promise of Olmstead is realized. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alison. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jalen Radzaminski. I worked at the Bazelon Center for just over 3 years, and I'm their former Director of Engagement. I am also the founder of Count Us In, which is the first Black disability-led nonpartisan nonprofit and movement who seeks to educate, empower, and show the communities that their voices matter by diversifying and increasing political participation and voter turnout. For a quick image description of myself, I'm a light-skinned Black Japanese disabled person with mid-length dark brown curly hair, and I am wearing a coral-colored shirt for you all today. And I also identify as a person with lived experience and expertise, as Megan earlier said, I like that term, of having mental health and physical disabilities. So today we wanted to show you all a video that we released last year. In partnership with Bazelon board member Sarah Kenningsberg, I created a short clip in honor of the impact Lois Curtis's life had as a better path forward. Through this project, I also wanted to amplify fellow Black women and Brown advocates that are fighting for a better, more inclusive future today. And after the narration in the video that you will all soon see, we will hear from Carrie Gray, the leader of Named Advocates, Karis Myrick, the Vice President and Partnerships of Inseparable and podcast host and creator of Unapologetically Black Unicorns. And last but not least, Vesper Moore, Bazelon Center board member and COO of Kiva Centers. So with that, we'll play the video.
In 1995, aspiring artist Lois Curtis was confined to a state-run institution in Atlanta, Georgia. Curtis was not alone. Thousands of people with disabilities were confined to state institutions. The women argued their right to live in integrated communities fully funded, and won.
Lois Curtis, to me, represents our need and our fight for bodily autonomy. What I respect about her legacy is her fight. She fought for her bodily autonomy and she won. And what I love about her is that she won not just for herself, but for the many of us who have come after her.
So for me as a brown disabled person, Lois Curtis's legacy, Olmstead, is symbolic of ideas of freedom and liberation that are important for disabled people, that are important for brown and black disabled people. That legacy and what that means is that we can live lives in the community just as any other person would.
As a Black disabled and psychiatric survivor, a person with a psychiatric disability, this means so much to me because so often things have been forced upon me without my choice, without my voice. And when I think about Lois and what she did, using her voice, being able to talk about the importance of choice, community inclusion, being a part of and developing a community that is for and by her with the supports that she needed, I know that I can speak up and do that as well.
Thank you, team, for sharing the video. I admire all of those speakers very much and grateful for all that they do in the community. And I'm grateful for the Bazelon Center for continuing to build up that video to honor Lois Curtis's life. And with that, I am very excited to transition to our live panel event. And just to reiterate, for accessibility, we have captions available today by clicking the captions button on the toolbar below, or by clicking the stream text link available in the chat. We also have 2 ASL interpreters available who will be spotlit throughout today's event. If you need assistance at any point, please email us at communications@bazelon.org. And if you're just joining, once again, my name is Jalen Radzaminski, former Director of Engagement at the Bazelon Center and founder of Count Us In. Joining us today, we have lived experience advocates, experts, and legal professionals to celebrate 25 years of this important precedent and discuss the importance of advocating for community-based services for children with mental disabilities. Today, we have Leanne Roberts, a lived experience advocate, Ariel Wolf, another lived experience advocate, Kim Campbell, LCSW, and Deputy County Administrator of Broward County, Florida, Ira Burnham, Senior Counsel of Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law, and Britt Vanneman, Staff Attorney at Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law. So thank you all again for joining us today. And if you all would like to give a brief introduction, about a minute of yourself and an image description. So first we'll go with Leanne.
My name is Leanne Roberts. A quick image description. I am wearing a brown blazer. I have long blonde hair, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm 19 years old and I love the water, painting, and reading. And currently I'm interning at an interior design company.
Thank you, Leanne. Next up is the amazing Senior Counsel, Ira Burnham.
Oh, I'm Ira Burnham, an older white male with graying hair and wearing a blue shirt. I had the good fortune to coordinate the effort to secure a victory in the Olmstead case in the Supreme Court. Before Olmstead, the Bazelon Center had brought many cases to secure community services for people who were institutionalized. We believe there should be a right to care in the community instead of an institution. And the Olmstead case offered the chance to establish such a right, relying on the Americans with Disabilities Act. As Alison mentioned, after the decision, the center helped develop a strategy for making the most of the Olmstead case, which had left many questions unanswered. Like other lawyers at Bazelon, I've litigated a number of Olmstead cases, including the KDA case in California, which involved children and youth. I'm excited to be here to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Olmstead.
Thank you, Ira. And next we have up Kim Campbell.
Hey everybody, I'm Kim Campbell, and my image description is that I'm a light-skinned Black woman with long curly black hair and what I think are pretty cute glasses, and I'm wearing a burgundy shirt. So in terms of my involvement with Olmstead, I have been consulting for about 15 years, partnering with Bazelon and Department of Justice and others. I do have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree with a specialization in family preservation in multicultural settings. And I just completed my doctorate in social work with a specialization in trauma-informed practice and leadership. So I am clinically licensed, and I've got over 28 years of experience working in and overseeing public human services. I'm currently the Deputy County Administrator in Broward County, Florida, and Human Services is one of the many agencies that I oversee. Prior to that, I was in North Carolina, first in the State Office of Children and Family Services, where I served as the Assistant Director for the state's System of Care Network, which spanned 26 counties, and then later served as the Children's Mental Health Director in Mecklenburg, which is the Charlotte area, where I worked across multiple systems to ensure that children and families with mental health needs were appropriately served. I would say that most of my work in this Olmstead area has really been involving individual case files, reviewing state mental health plans and Medicaid plans, interviewing children and families, their natural supports, doing observations in the field, talking to providers. And what I do is offer findings on the gaps in the services and then make recommendations on needed improvements, not only at the individual case level, but also at the systemic level as well. I think I bring a unique perspective because not only do I have the clinical expertise in the field, but I also, as a public administrator, administer millions and millions and millions of dollars to provider networks to serve kids and families. Always partnering with what they say they need. So I'm very happy to be here and looking forward to participating and listening to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim. And my apologies. It looks like everyone was supposed to introduce themselves for 5 minutes. So I wanted to circle back to Leanne in case you wanted to add anything else about all of your experiences and advocacy.
Yeah, so when I was just 12 years old, my parents went through a pretty nasty divorce. And from a young age, I could see that there was something wrong in my family dynamic. My mother is an addict. And so pretty quickly, an education consultant was introduced to our dynamic. And it was recommended through them that I would attend a wilderness program called Trails North Carolina. Trails no longer operates. It was recently shut down because they failed to cooperate with regulations. And just this February, another child had died in their facility due to unnatural causes. The education consultant advised that I would do better away from my parents' divorce and that it would allow me to have independence, boost my self-esteem and provide me structure. However, during my enrollment there, I experienced things that no child ever really should. It was recorded that I weighed 90 pounds upon entry and I left weighing barely 80. Instead of facilitating necessary and humane bathroom breaks, we were forced to wet ourselves and were given adult diapers. Restrictive methods were often used in situations that did not call for them. I would watch adults push the faces of my friends into the ground, and there was nothing I could do to help. And communication to parents was strictly monitored. From trails, I would spend the next 5 years briefly in and out of facilities, caught in a system and cycle that, in my opinion, is set up in a way to keep children in it. So to say that growing up in facilities like trails has had an impact on me would be an understatement. I lost my whole childhood, and so far my whole adult life has been committed to reprocessing and healing from the trauma I experienced.
Thank you so much, Leanne, and we're so grateful that you're here today. And last but certainly not least, Ariel, if you would like to introduce yourself and your experiences as well.
My name is Ariel Wolf. An image description of me. I am a 31-year-old disabled white woman with curly brown hair, and I'm wearing a blue shirt. I live and work in Holly Springs, North Carolina as a dog trainer, and I specialize in service dog and competition obedience training. I have had the symptoms of bipolar disorder since I was about 5 years old, and I actually was really lucky. To my parents' credit, they did everything right, and the cards that I drew in life, I was living in an upper middle class home. Both of my parents were together. They loved me. Both were highly educated and spared no expense in terms of time and money for getting me the care that I needed. Unfortunately, my mental illness continued to progress. And when I was 13 years old, I was hospitalized for the first time. And that hospitalization was the first of about 30 separate inpatient hospitalizations. And there was also 3 psychiatric residential treatment facilities that I spent anywhere between 4 and 11 months in. So in total, I was treated in 6 different states and for a total of more than 3 years of my adolescence. And during that time, I lived alongside thousands of girls, and just simply through the cards that they were dealt, many of these girls didn't have a voice or somebody who would listen to them. And so I'm really grateful to be here today to be able to share my voice and my story, both on my own behalf and on behalf of many of those girls.
Thank you so much, Ariel. And we're so glad you're here with us as well. And we're actually, last but not least, we're bringing up our last attorney that we're introducing, Britt. Would love to hear more about your experience, your image description before we get started on the panel.
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's a real honor to be here today and to sit on this panel with such incredible advocates. My name is Britt Vanneman. I am a white woman with long, dark blonde hair. I'm wearing a bright green shirt with flowers to make up for my backdrop, which is sadly a very plain white wall because I just moved. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a staff attorney at the Bazelon Center. And I joined the center straight out of law school because this is the exact issue that I wanted to work on. So it's a real full circle moment for me today. I want to start by talking about one of Bazelon's systemic youth Olmstead cases that I have had the honor of working on, because I believe it distills many of the problems and the solutions into one single case. And then I will discuss some trends and takeaways from recent cases and federal agency investigations. First, the case I want to tell you about is MJ versus the District of Columbia, an Olmstead case seeking community-based mental health services to children in the district so that they can live with their families and not be institutionalized to receive care. In 2018, the Bazelon Center, along with co-counsel Disability Rights DC, the National Center for Youth Law, and the law firm Schulte, Roth, and Zabel, filed a class action on behalf of hundreds of district children. The complaint alleges that the district violates the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, and the Medicaid Act by failing to provide youth with medically necessary services in community settings, and as a result, placing them at risk of institutionalization and incarceration. The ADA, thanks to Olmstead, requires the district to serve children with disabilities in the most integrated setting appropriate. For virtually all children, this setting is their own home or with another family. The Medicaid Act requires states, including the district, to provide all medically necessary services to children under 21 who are enrolled in Medicaid. These medically necessary services include intensive community-based services, and I'll describe those specific services hopefully later on in the panel. DC children have drastically curtailed life opportunities because they have not received these community-based services. They are cycling in and out of psychiatric hospitals, in and out of other residential treatment facilities, juvenile detention facilities, and group homes, including in facilities that are out of state and far from their homes, families, and support systems. Over the course of the case, we've had a group of experts, including Kim Campbell on our panel today, look at records and interview children and youth to understand what's been going on. One mother described how her daughter has cycled through the district's psychiatric hospitals and has been sent away to institutions as far away as Georgia and Florida for treatment, where the daughter was then physically abused. The experts found that all of the youth who participated in the study needed but have not received intensive mental health services delivered in their own homes and communities. Most of them have been placed in psychiatric institutions and are still at serious risk of institutionalization or incarceration. Based on this review, it was clear that there were hundreds of children in the district who should be but are not getting the supports that they need. And for now, we are still awaiting a decision on our motion for class certification. You can stay up to date by checking our website. And then next, I just want to briefly touch on a few other trends in litigation and agency investigations. So first, we've seen more Olmstead cases against states for failing to provide sufficient community-based services and finding that children are languishing in congregate settings because they cannot access services at home or in the community. We heard about some of these accounts actually today in a Senate Finance hearing on youth residential treatment. Senate Finance Committee issued a report detailing the neglect and harms that children experience in these facilities. I am optimistic that there could be bipartisan support after listening to Senator Wyden and Senator Crapo. If I can, I'll try to pop that report in the chat. We also have had plaintiffs file youth Olmstead cases in Colorado, North Carolina, Louisiana, and Georgia. I know we have colleagues joining us today who are litigating these important matters. There's also ongoing litigation and monitoring in Michigan and West Virginia, as well in Florida, where a favorable decision is on appeal in the 11th Circuit. Bazelon filed an amicus brief for that appeal with the Center for Public Representation, the National Health Law Program, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and others. Second, the U.S. Department of Justice has launched more investigations and found that states are failing to provide the community-based services that kids need. These investigations have taken place in Rhode Island, Maine, Nevada, and Alaska. Of note, in the investigations, DOJ has found that states are over-relying on emergency departments to treat behavioral health conditions, and there's an increasing rate of inpatient hospital admissions for children as a result. For example, in Rhode Island, the average length of a child's psychiatric hospitalization was 51 days, though the program was designed to last only 1 to 2 weeks. Even when discharged to residential treatment, kids are staying for months and years. In Nevada, the average length of stay in residential treatment was 9 months to 1 year. 27% of children stayed over a year in that facility. States are also continuing to send children out of state. Nearly half of the children in Nevada who had stays over a year were in out-of-state residential facilities. There's also a disproportionate impact on Black and Brown children with disabilities, as has been noted, as well as Native children with disabilities. For example, in DOJ's report from Alaska, DOJ noted that Alaska Native children make up only 1/6 of the population, but account for 1/3 of the children placed in psychiatric facilities. DOJ explained how this compounds the trauma of past generations where Alaska Native youth were routinely taken from their communities and sent to boarding schools. DOJ has also made a few important clarifications from its investigations and recent regulations. First, DOJ has said that the adequacy of community-based services for youth is crucial. It's not enough for the state on paper to say that they provide certain services or claim that they offer them. Kids must actually be able to access them in practice. DOJ has also emphasized the expense of congregate care over community-based treatment. In Nevada, for example, a residential treatment facility costs the state $990 a day per youth, and hospitalization costs a staggering $2,700 a day per youth. This is compared to the cost of intensive home and community-based services and therapeutic foster care placement, which totals $300 a day per youth. That's a difference of $2,400 a day a youth. Finally, DOJ has said that when states rely on carceral settings like jails and detention facilities to provide treatment for children with mental health disabilities, these facilities should also be considered segregated settings that can violate Olmstead. So to conclude, we're seeing more application of the integration mandate to different systems, including education and foster care systems. I've already talked for too long, but I'm happy to chat more about any of these examples and issues in detail. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Britt. So with that, we'll jump right into the panel. And I feel like Britt already laid the foundation of the importance of this issue, but to learn a little bit more about that, I wanted to switch it over to some of the other panelists. What have your experiences been in hospitalization and institutionalization, and what do you all see as harms? So first, I'll pass the mic to Ariel.
One of the biggest issues for me is that a lot of these institutional settings are really dumping grounds for the unwanted and unmanageable children. So you can have kids who, in my experience, I had a great home. I had no trauma prior to going into the institutional setting. All I had was a pure mental health disability. And that did need, treatment in a residential setting. However, there was also just kids who were from foster care and they were just burning through foster homes. There were kids who were conduct disordered, but they hadn't yet committed a crime so severe to necessitate going to juvenile detention. There were children who had very severe intellectual disabilities, and there just was no other placement for them. Their own home was, their needs were too severe for their caregivers, but they couldn't find a traditional foster home to be able to care for them. So it's really that, you can't treat everyone, especially when you're trying to treat everyone the same. And that's one of the biggest issues with fallout, because if you can't treat everyone the same, no one gets treated.
Such an important point. Thank you, Ariel. And Leanne, I wanted to also pass the mic to you to see if there's anything you wanted to share or add on to that.
Truthfully, I feel like she said it all. I can only speak from, my experience and just how isolating it really is to be institutionalized, and how hard it is to kind of foster your own growth and development. I think there's an underlying narrative in institutions that you're not able to function outside, or in society like somebody else would. And I think that that's super damaging, especially for children, because I know personally for myself, it's taken so long to kind of feel comfortable moving through things without feeling like there's a label on my forehead of like dysfunctional that only other people can see. So I just second everything that she said, and then that as well.
Thank you, Leanne. And for this question, I also wanted to ask Kim what your thoughts were as well.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So, we have empirical data that illustrate the tangible and intangible costs of removing children from their homes. And we know that it's severe. We know that it causes trauma and that the effects of that trauma are physical and psychological and neurobiological, and that those impacts can literally last a lifetime in some cases. We also know that children placed in congregate care facilities are more susceptible to physical abuse, sexual abuse, disconnection from their families and communities. They're more likely to be involved with juvenile justice. They're more likely to have poor academic performance. I mean, there's just so many negative outcomes as a consequence of being sent away. It isn't to say that there isn't a place in the continuum of care for psychiatric residential treatment and short-term stabilization in psychiatric hospitals, but they're not made to be places that raise children, and they're causing harm because that's the way they're being used. Kids there are made to adhere to unrealistic rules, and it's an artificial environment that's not reflective of their homes or their schools and communities. And the transition home can really be disastrous because of a failure to prepare both the children and families for that transition. And there's also a failure to shore up the community resources needed for success. And that contributes to really high rates of readmission and further traumatization. So, it's just not a viable option for our kids.
Thank you so much, Kim. And I feel like this lays out the issue so well in so many different perspectives and ways. And if people in the audience, if there are questions that come up, please feel free to add them to the Q&A chat so we can Q&A function at the bottom bar of your screen so that we can maybe dig deeper too after the preset panel questions. So the other question that I had for you all today is, as we all know, the Olmstead versus LC or Lois Curtis precedent created the federal requirements for integration in our communities. And what has helped you and others succeed in the community? And what are the benefits of receiving services in the community compared to those experiences in institutionalization? So first, again, I'll kick it to Ariel and then would love to hear Leanne as well.
So I want to highlight one of the big differences between the psychiatric and physical health systems. And when you have children who have physical conditions that are so severe as to necessitate hospitalization, those kids are often given the best foods, the best care. They have really, strong community access because those have been clinically proven time and time again to be what is going to best necessitate healing. And conversely, on the mental health side, you've got children who are in the emergency room next to grown adults who are drunk, high, or experiencing, psychiatric emergencies that could be very scary or traumatizing. Then they're, put into hospitals and residential treatment facilities and intentionally isolated from their families and every other support who could care for them and make sure that there is oversight for their ongoing treatment. And so one of the biggest things that I would love to see is, especially in residential facilities and settings, for that family bond to be continually fostered.
Thank you, Ariel. And Leanne, is there anything you would want to share or add?
In terms of like community placement being a better option, for me, it's been so changing. Just reaching out to outpatient therapy has been one of the bravest things that I've ever done, truly. It's changed the way that I view mental health help. And it's allowed me to continue living life as a 19-year-old girl without it consuming everything else. It's a balance between like I can pursue mental health and growth and interchange like I think everyone should, while still, hanging out with my friends on the weekend. And it doesn't have to be so one or the other. It doesn't feel so isolating.
Thank you both for that. And yeah, that is definitely an issue of, like you all were saying earlier, not individualizing our experience because we all navigate this in different ways and not separating the worlds. Like you were saying, Leanne, it's so important for us to have bonds with our friends, and like Ariel was saying, our family, our community, because that's community is what, keeps us strong as well. And I wanted to kick it to another question is just from a legal and expert side as well. How do services from the legal precedent serve youth compared to adults in these settings? And what services are needed for youth with intense or complex needs to be served in home and community-based settings, since they tend to benefit us so much? And first, I'll kick this question to Britt.
Sure. Thanks, Jalen. I would like to address the second question of what services we see are most successful for children with intensive needs. So we often talk about this in terms of children who have what's called serious emotional disturbance. And even children who have SED should receive intensive community-based services and are able to stay in the community. There's no reason or no need just by having that label that a child needs to end up in any kind of an institutional or congregate setting. So ICBS are the set of services that we typically talk about in reference to this group of kids with intensive needs. And I'll note that intensive community-based services, or ICBS, there are a lot of acronyms. I am just sorry about that. Hope you can follow along. ICBS has been referred to by other names, including intensive in-home and community supports. But the components are largely the same and agreed upon across experts and across the data. So ICBS, at least as we've defined it in the MJ case, which I was speaking about earlier, includes 3 distinct services. The first is intensive care coordination. The second, behavior support services. And the third are mobile crisis services. So I'll briefly describe each one. The first pillar of ICBS is intensive care coordination, or ICC, which is an intensive form of case management that's led by a child and family team. So the child and family team is really the core and center of this system of support. They design and supervise a plan that coordinates services for the child. The child and family team should include the child's family, natural caregivers, any service providers, and other folks identified by the family as engaging with the child and knowing their strengths and needs. The CFT, child and family team, should meet regularly and monitor the child's progress. And if a child's placement needs to change or services aren't working, it would be the child and family team who would first meet to identify issues and come together and make a plan to re-coordinate the care. Intensive care coordination is also sometimes known as high fidelity wraparound or intensive case management, but whatever you call it, this child and family teaming at the center is key. Another crucial component of teaming is peer support. So SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, recently issued guidance which said that family and youth peer support are essential components in a children's system of care. So peer support means that someone with lived experience mentors and guides a person in need of support, relying on their own firsthand experiences with the services and the systems. Research has demonstrated that peer support facilitates recovery. It benefits parents and caregivers by reducing stress and increasing social supports, and it reduces healthcare costs. So family and youth peer support workers should be an integral part of the child and family team. The second pillar of intensive community-based services are intensive behavior supports. So these are individualized therapeutic interventions, which are provided on a frequent and consistent basis and are designed to improve behavior. So they should be delivered to children and families in any setting where the child is located. These interventions can include services that folks might be familiar with, like therapy, individual and family therapy, medication management, but it could also include supports like housing assistance or employment or transportation. This component is often referred to sometimes as therapeutic treatment and community recovery services. So the third pillar of intensive community-based services are mobile crisis services. So states must provide a mobile, on-site, in-person response to children experiencing a crisis, which is available at any time or any place for the purpose of identifying, helping, assessing, stabilizing the youth where they are, and to reduce the immediate risk of harm. So these services should be delivered in the child's home. A mobile crisis team could be called to school or to other community settings. It should be available 24/7 and delivered by a mental health trained responder and not the police. These mobile response and crisis services should then connect the child to continued community services and supports once they're stabilized. So these three pillars are all important on their own, but the system is not intensive unless all of them function together and function with fidelity. So there has to be coordination between the mobile crisis, between the intensive behavior support services and the child family team. For example, if a child experiences a crisis, the mobile crisis team would respond using the crisis plan developed by the child and family team, and then link the child to intensive behavior supports in the home and community once stabilized. So that is really the array of services that we're talking about in Olmstead services for youth with intensive behavioral health needs. I'm sure Kim will have a lot more to add on to that, as well as Ira.
Thank you so much, Britt. And yeah, so I'll kick it to Ira. You know, what can we do to specifically serve youth, and what needs to be done to help people stay in these community-based settings?
Well, I think Britt's done a great job outlining, the technology that we bring to bear on the problem. I'd say what's interesting is in many ways, the services for kids are similar to the services for adults. A good ACT team operates really much like a child and family team. So the person being served, should have a strong voice and really be involved in identifying that person's needs, the services that are going to make the most sense, and how we can, as a team, make sure that institutionalization is avoided. One obvious difference between adults and children is that children live in families. Adults live on their own. And so as Britt described, the services that are in place have to recognize that, but also have to, very, very dedicatedly support children living in a family. So, as a legal matter, we have long argued that for children, living at home is quote unquote the most integrated setting, which is what Olmstead and the ADA requires. So that, the law says that service systems must help children stay at home. And, when that can't be achieved, help them live with some different family, with relatives, a foster family, an adoptive family. And as we were very pleased to see that recently HHS's new Section 504 regs, as Alison mentioned, and also DOJ and findings letters have articulated this understanding of the law, that what it means to apply Olmstead for kids is to support them living in a family. And that's a really important concept.
Absolutely. And Kim, anything you would like to add to the discussion about keeping youth in the community?
Sure, thank you. I agree that Britt did a great job reviewing the core services that need to be in place. And there are others, right? You need evidence-based clinical services, and you need to include natural supports that can play a role so that families aren't dependent on the formal system forever, because who wants that? But I think what I would add is sort of an up level to the systemic level conversation, which is that it's beautiful to have all of these service providers in place delivering these services with fidelity, but that can't happen in a bubble, right? It has to happen in partnership with kids and families. Number one, people need to listen to them and be responsive to what it is they say they need for themselves. But beyond that, it needs to be coordinated by the system, right? So there should be a set of guiding principles that everybody agrees that they're going to deliver these unique set of services under, such as family-driven and youth-guided and culturally responsive and collaborative, and all of those things that sort of shape the way we approach and deal with kids and families. There needs to be accountability mechanisms in place and oversight and data management systems so that we know what's happening with kids and families in their homes and in their communities, so that we can immediately make changes when we see that harms are being perpetuated against them. We need financing structures so that community-based services are appropriately resourced. They're much more inexpensive than residential facilities are, and we can leverage those dollars to get more bang for the buck. So, again, it's important to have those services in place and that those services are delivered with fidelity, but they have to be coordinated within the broader system. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim. And oftentimes, and I know Leanne and Ariel alluded to this earlier, but oftentimes when youth are institutionalized, similar to the carceral system, there's recidivism and cycling between more than one system. And I know you, Britt, and I were all talking about how important it is for things to be comprehensive. So can we talk about how does this cycling happen a little bit deeper and what the experiences have been? So first I'll turn it to Leanne to just share her thoughts on this. Yeah, what would you like to share?
Yeah, so my personal experience is I was enrolled in one wilderness camp or residential treatment center with the intention and communication to my father being that I would come home after. It was not disclosed that they strongly recommend to send your child to another facility directly after a short stay one. And so once I completed and I graduated, I complied with their program. I came home for about a year and it was like dropping a fish in cold water. It was culture shock. I was confused. I didn't know, I was starting my freshman year of high school. So I was going into like orientation and I had no idea for the past 2 years what new movies had come out, what new artists there were, anything at all to connect with other kids my age. So already I was set up for, struggle and not success. And so then I was re-enrolled into an institution because they kind of, or at least in my experience, normal teenage boundaries and experimental behavior and, pushing on your parents and things, those are deemed as aggressive or toxic behaviors and traits that need to be treated. And so from my family and from my dad, it was very ingrained for him that like if I were to be anything other than a people pleaser, I needed to be sent back into these facilities. And I think that that's the narrative for a lot of kids who, are doing everything that they can and complying to the best of their ability. I think it's a never-ending cycle until you kind of age out. I don't know personally with all the boys and girls that I was in treatment with, I don't know one child who's only been to one facility.
Thank you, Leanne. And that's something I know I've experienced as well after these settings. It can be like night and day, and you are programmed to please everyone around you, which isn't helpful at all. So thank you for sharing that. And I also wanted to bring it back to Kim. We're talking about comprehensiveness just from your perspective systemically. How is this cycling happening when we know it's so harmful?
Yeah, I really think that it's a matter of prioritization of the resources, right? I mean, we spend billions on the residential treatment level of care. And if we had those resources pumped into community-based services and we actually had an accountability system in place with standards and guiding principles and support, not only for the system of providers, but for the kids and families who are accessing services, we would go a long way to using these settings for their intended purpose and no longer than that. Oftentimes kids are trapped in there because there isn't anywhere to transition to. And then when they are transitioned, the services are not there to support them because there's a lack of coordination. There's a lack of transition planning. There's just a lack of people ready to support what kids need to be successful in the community. And that's primarily because in those artificial settings, they're not being taught and coached about those things. They're just taught to adhere to a random point system to earn tokens and treats, right? And that's not reflective of reality. So unfortunately, when we don't prioritize the resources to what we know works, we see cycling and recycling through systems that don't work.
Thank you, Kim. Literally, to restate, systems that do not work. Cannot emphasize that enough. Oh, Ira, you came off mute. Did you want to add something?
No, I think people have described it well. I would just say that in the cases we do, we often focus on, those kids who sort of end up in this kind of cycling. And it's actually really surprised me, and I'm hard to surprise. I'm difficult to surprise the number of kids who experience this and the number of placements they experience. I mean, it's really awful and tragic. And so one of the reasons I think that we've been able to be successful in our litigation is that even judges who may not be wild about civil rights or about disability rights, I think they kind of understand that this is really unacceptable. And you bring in people like Kim who can explain, and it doesn't have to be this way. That really moves the court.
Thank you, Ira. And I was going to go right to you, Britt, to see what you wanted to add.
Wanted to jump onto that because the numbers are really concerning, and obviously taxpayers don't want to be investing in services that are, one, so expensive, but two, that don't work, and just continue to reinvest in this cycle. It makes no sense at all. So from a fiscal point of view, it's just wild. One thing I wanted to note is that in the DOJ investigation in Rhode Island, just a quick stat, they found that nearly a quarter of the youth hospitalized were re-hospitalized less than 30 days after they were discharged. A quarter were back in these facilities less than 30 days after they had been discharged. And personally, I had a recent experience with a client that makes this statistic less shocking. But as a child and youth, this client had not received the community-based services that they needed to treat their disabilities. They ended up in jail where they didn't receive any treatment while they were incarcerated. They were not hooked up to services when they were released. Instead, they were transferred to release on a reentry program, which was intended to hook them up to specialized services, but did not. They were not connected to Medicaid while they were in this reentry program. We had to push case managers to re-enroll him, which was not successful. I'm an attorney who specializes in this work, and trying to coordinate these services for him and navigate the system was so incredibly difficult, and nobody wanted to give answers or provide help. So I think the amount of time that people spend in these institutional and congregate settings where nobody is doing in-reach or any service or transition planning to make sure that when people are out and back to the community, that they have what they need to be successful, it's a shame, but it's also just no wonder that recidivism is such a problem.
Absolutely. Wow. Less than a month, basically a month. And Ariel, I wanted to also bring this back to you, just with the cycling, what have your experiences been and what have you seen?
So there's 3 instances that I experienced that I just want to bring up. The first was actually during my very first hospitalization. I was 13 years old, and a staff member said, "I'm going to be seeing 2/3 of you back at some point in the next couple of years." And I thought to myself, well, that's not going to be me. Spoiler alert, it was me. But the other 2 both occurred at my 3rd residential placement, which was Acadia Village. I never made it out to the cabins. You were supposed to, spend a week or two in their admission unit, getting stabilized, getting acquainted, and then you would get shipped off to a cabin. I never got stabilized. The psychiatrist was adamant that I had a condition that I did not, and was adamant for treating me incorrectly based on ego. And so I ended up super psychotic and harming myself despite having a one-on-one sitter 24/7. I ended up in the hospital multiple times. I ended up getting surgery at the hospital multiple times. And every time I would come to the hospital, I would have to get seen by the family services, team. And there was no other placement. I kept begging for them to put me somewhere else, anywhere else, but there was no higher level of placement for them to put me. And the last instance, there was also, again, Acadia Village. There was 7 girls who planned a riot. Some of them had been through the juvenile justice system previously, and decided that going to juvie would be better than being in the program. And because of that, they did massive thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars worth of damage to the building, and they ended up brutalizing a staff member who was severely injured. I have memories of, just having to step over this blood puddle and sitting with this one girl who was intellectually disabled, not able to understand what was going on very well, and trying to keep her calm. So all 7 girls were taken off the property, processed into the juvenile justice system. 6 were returned the next day. The one who was not was the one who was primarily responsible for the assault on the staff member.
Wow. Thank you so much just for sharing that. And yeah, wow. Well, I think it's a good moment for us to kind of process all that was shared with just the lived experiences. And I'm sure my fellow as a past Bazelonian frustrations, and I know Kim's an expert, it could be very frustrating working in allyship and having lived experience and expertise in this space, to take a deep breath and just think about the future for a second here. Just before I turn it over to the audience, just wanted to give my panelists time to take a deep breath. Attendees to take a moment and just talk about what we can do to move forward for the future and what the emerging issues are on the horizon. And yeah, just if you could wave a magic wand, what would you all like to see in 25 years to achieve true integration and inclusion for youth with mental disabilities? And first, I will pass this question to Ariel.
I feel like there, for me personally, there were no outpatient services that were successful. I was one of the unusual ones, particularly at the time of my adolescence, 15 years ago, where any services that were available, I had access to, and they didn't work for me. But there was a lot of adolescents that I, was alongside who they had a fight with their parents. They threatened suicide or self-harm or to hurt their parents, just in the course of an argument. They absolutely didn't mean it. And, ended up in a revolving door, ball rolling sort of situation where once they got in, they couldn't get out. So I would love to see the services that are available be catching some of those cases and cases that can be treated outpatient earlier, sooner, and dealing with that. And then the ones who do need to be addressed inpatient be really more tailored to the individual and their needs, and less of a catch-all, throw everything at the wall and see what sticks.
Definitely. Britt, what would your vision be?
I have too many to narrow down. I'll pick a couple. So there are a few emerging issues here that I think are really promising and I'm excited about. So first is the realization that law enforcement responses to children with disabilities puts them at risk of institutionalization. And I think we'll see a body of law hopefully develop around that. The Department of Justice has recognized that when crisis services are not available and families are directed to call law enforcement, that puts children at serious risk of entering the juvenile justice system. And I think that's a big step forward and can't wait to see what happens with that. We're also seeing an increasing use of AI-based, artificial intelligence-based automated decision-making tools that use mental health diagnoses and treatment as risk factors and as the bases for taking kids away from parents in the child welfare system, which is where we see those tools are especially problematic. But the future is unknown, and I'm sure these tools will continue to spread and grow. And how Olmstead applies to the use is a hot issue. And in good news, we're seeing more systems serving youth where children with disabilities are segregated and placed in more restrictive settings, but Olmstead is being recognized as applying to those settings. So I'm thinking about the immigration system in particular, that where children are segregated because of their disabilities and not served in the most integrated setting, that's a violation of Olmstead. And I think we'll see positive reforms from those efforts. Just to sum it up, I hope in 25 years, none of us have to be here. We're talking about all of the institutions and facilities that have closed and have all of the data that proves community-based services are effective, and there's buy-in for that.
Thank you, Britt. I'd love to work myself out of the job as well. I totally hear you. And Ira, what is your vision for in the next 25 years, just for true integration and inclusion of our youth with mental disabilities?
Well, I was going to say something similar to Britt, that 25 years from now, we couldn't imagine having a panel like this. It's like been there, done that, took care of that problem. I'm, when I look at sort of the landscape, I have some concerns. And, a couple of them are challenges that we've always faced, for voters, for Congress, for state legislators. Implementing Olmstead is really a pretty low priority. If they have the attention and resources and there's a big enough political fuss, maybe from time to time they'll invest in that effort. But it's a low priority, which for them, which I think puts a heavy burden on those who run systems, because they have some competing priorities, but also, they don't really have the resources they need. The other challenge that we've always faced, which I think is becoming less of a challenge, but is still a real one, is that, and I'll just, as no one's mentioned, I'll just say it, the private providers are the backbone of mental health systems and child welfare systems. It's all managed, as Kim said, by the public system. But the providers have a lot of clout with the system's leadership and with legislators. And providers often resist change. And it's not necessarily because they don't like community services or they don't like the idea of Olmstead or they don't respect civil rights, but they've done things in a certain way. They live in a pretty in an environment in which resources are scarce. They've figured out how to keep their programs running using a certain economic model. And unfortunately, that model often includes and sometimes relies on institutional care, which I think, as people have mentioned, is very highly compensated. So I think we need to continue to see the provider community, kind of develop and work with them to, address issues they have with transitioning to more Olmstead implementation. And the last, which I guess is more recent, courts are getting pretty conservative, or at least more conservative. The presidential election may determine whether that continues or there's a change. And, while I don't think litigation is the answer to Olmstead implementation or really to any problem, I think how courts interpret and apply Olmstead does make a difference. The law affects behavior, including the behavior of those who run systems. And I think we'll see some significant regression if somehow as a legal matter, the Olmstead obligation becomes a dead letter or really, sort of loses its bite. So that is one thing I worry about and hope not to see in the next 25 years.
Absolutely. We need every tool in the toolbox to get this future that we really need, so this won't be an issue in 25 years, like you and Britt were saying. And Kim, what is your vision for the next 25 years? What do you see on the horizon?
So I'll share a couple of things. I think it's exciting what Alison shared in terms of the recent policy changes, and those are promising. I think, though, that states have demonstrated they need, we'll call it encouragement to comply. So we really need to focus on building accountability structures and tie those to funding as a next step. I think from both a clinical and systemic perspective, there's a couple things happening. There's the burgeoning movement to integrate trauma-informed care principles with system of care principles, but there's also a burgeoning movement to integrate anti-racism principles, acknowledging the stark disproportionality and disparate outcomes for Black, Brown, and Native children across every single public system that inappropriately separates and segregates their children. So, I think there may be some promising research and clinical services that emerge out of these movements that are really happening at the grassroots level, and then, again, at the service level. It would be really nice for states and communities to prioritize funding services that have been proven to work, let alone those that are more cost effective. So we don't have to keep suing them to make them do the right thing. But I guess we'll just have to see how that goes. Ira makes a good point that for-profit private providers, they hire lobbyists and they contribute to political campaigns. And unfortunately, that influences the policy that comes out, or at least the accountability towards adhering to policy that comes out. So we'll just have to see. I also would be remiss if I didn't address what Britt brought up in the realm of AI, because I don't want us to be asleep at the wheel and fail to acknowledge that we do have new research that's showing there's an issue with implicit bias that perpetuates racism, even in artificial intelligence and its use. And so if we don't get at the crux of what we're talking about in terms of systemic racism that so disproportionately impacts these communities of color, even with the brilliance that is AI, we will continue to perpetuate the same disparate outcomes. And 25 years from now, we'll still be talking about the same thing.
Thank you so much, Kim. And Leanne, what is your vision? What do you see on the horizon?
Just putting emphasis on everything that was already said. But to circle back to what Ariel said about, some of those cases where maybe that's not the level of care needed. That was personally my situation, and I was stuck in a kind of vicious cycle of being readmitted, and it's a hard thing to get out of. But I hope that, in 25 years, we aren't so quick to medicate, we aren't so quick to label, we aren't so quick to institutionalize, and we find like the least restrictive support option, that those are the rings that are jumped through first, and we don't just jump through or to like hospitalization or things that really do and can be traumatic for children.
Thank you so much, Leanne. And so now, thank you all just for sharing your visions for the future. And I want to turn it over to the Q&A segment. I know people have been posting questions throughout you all's talk, just to see what the audience is asking as well. So I'm going to go ahead and check to see. Okay, here we go. Oh, if I can. One audience. Okay, so one audience question that came up is for you, for whom it is not safe to stay in the family home. What are the best practices for placement and treatment with community access? And I'm not sure if Kim.
Yeah,
can fill
yeah,
in.
I was just about to jump in. So I think it's important to take an individualized approach to this. I think safety is subjective, and I think that there are resources and supports that can be put into place when you do a proactive crisis and safety plan, so that you can readily anticipate what causes a crisis, what it looks like for a child and family, and what resources and supports they would need in place in order to be responsive to that crisis situation, so that you don't have to remove children from their homes. I think that if it does become necessary to move someone out of their house because it's a last resort, then you go to the next level of care that is least restrictive. You don't go automatically to psychiatric residential treatment facility for a 12-month stay, right? So, you know, again, I think it's individualized, and proactive crisis planning with the availability of mobile crisis response units is really where it's at.
Absolutely. And another question that we had, and as many activists say, complying with disability rights and this precedent is essentially the floor, not the ceiling. So how can states comply with this precedent, Olmstead versus LC, Lois Curtis, and what are the biggest obstacles or hurdles for compliance and improvement? And I'm curious, Ira, if you had thoughts on this question. Oh, sorry, you're muted. You're okay.
There we go. I was going to say, some of this I think we've addressed. Yeah, there is a lot of inertia, I would say, in the system, and some resistance to change, if not, vested interests that resist change. And so, I mean, I think we're making a lot of progress, and I'd have to say that Olmstead has had a bigger impact than I would have predicted right after the Supreme Court decision, which, left a lot of questions unanswered. But I think the disability community has done a good job in helping Olmstead be interpreted and applied in a really progressive way. The federal government has been great with the Department of Justice, and the Department of Health and Human Services really working hard. So I think, we need to continue, as I said, to make progress. And, I worry about the courts, and I guess, what what would happen in in the next Republican administration, and how Olmstead and Olmstead enforcement would come out. I think, we don't know, but but the fact that we don't know is pretty concerning.
Definitely. And I'll try to squeeze this last audience question in for the panel. Anonymous attendee is asking what the status of the Michigan case is, and they're saying they're from Michigan, and it seems like the country is largely a creative writing exercise.
Well,
I don't.
I
Go
can't.
ahead, Ira.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to the Michigan case specifically. I think, it's often the case that things start slowly after there's a settlement or a ruling. I think it's almost always the case that implementation is imperfect, which I think is why it's so important that we recognize, I think, as this panel is doing, that Olmstead is, it's not simply a legal matter or a framework for litigation, but it's kind of a rallying cry for changing the system and for preventing institutionalization and really supporting, children and youth, and living with their families and enjoying all of the opportunities of being in the community and not being shunted off to an institution. So I can't speak to Michigan, and but it's one should not expect, unfortunately, a complete reform as a result of litigation. That really comes, I think, as a result of kind of the political change and overcoming some of the challenges that we've been discussing today.
Definitely. And Britt, was there anything you wanted to add to before we wrap up today?
Yeah, and again, I'm not going to speak specifically to the details of the monitoring in Michigan, but I think that's, as Ira noted, a part of the struggle here is that if the community-based services aren't in place and aren't functioning, and we need to rely on those systems to reduce institutionalization, that's a problem, and it just takes time. And we see that there's a workforce shortage. We know that there are difficulties across the healthcare system, but these things have to go together and work together and come at the same time. And so I think that's just a really difficult part about implementing any of these settlement agreements, is that it takes time to get everything set up. It takes time to see if the services are working, to see what outcomes are happening, to see if services are being delivered with fidelity, and to get the outcomes from the kids, right, who are experiencing this. And so it's not surprising to me that it would feel like it's a lot of words on paper at this point. Hopefully it will turn into something more positive.
Thank you both. And thank you, everyone. Leanne, Ariel, Ira, Britt, Kim, thank you all so much just for being here today and sharing all of your expertise from different angles of this issue. And for the audience members, you heard it here. We need to have individualized focuses on people who need support to be in the community, right? We spoke about it here today, that we need these systems to be comprehensive. They need to be anti-racist. They need to be trauma-informed. And in pulling from what Ira said earlier, I'm inferring, Ira said, we can't just litigate this away. And like Britt said, we need time for these different alternative models like peer support, trauma-informed care to have a chance to take hold. So, we need to use every tool in the toolbox, from organizing to funding these alternative solutions to voting to mobilizing and organizing. So I hope that everybody who came here today, if you're not already in this movement, however you can do it, please come and join it, because I know Bazelon always organizes all the great people that are passionate about these issues and doing the work. So this is your call to join and support. And you can learn so much more and stay up to date by following the Bazelon Center on almost all social media: Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, or X, however you like to call it these days, as well as their YouTube channel. You can watch this year's event to celebrate 25 years. Share it with your friends on June 22nd. That's the actual anniversary date. So go ahead, share it with your colleagues, your friends, your family. Share information from Bazelon's website. There's so many ways to spread the word and just continue learning and getting involved in this movement, as you can see from all the different panelists here today. So I just wanted to give a special shout out and thank you again to all the speakers, from the panel to the keynote to Megan's introductory address. And thank you all just from across the US and across disciplines joining us to tune in today and celebrate and continue thinking about how we will move forward for the next 25 years. So thank you all again for joining, and I hope you all have a good day. Take care, everyone.
Are we debriefing or are we done?